Okay, there we go. So it should be nice and big now. So I want to thank you guys for coming and taking part in the webinar today. It's called Interview Excellence. We're going to be going over some interview strategies, some tips and tricks for answering common questions or dealing with difficult questions. And we're going to talk a lot too about just what to do in order to prepare for a job interview. So as I just sort of mentioned, some of the ground we're going to cover today, how to prepare for the interview, what you want to think of in terms of dressing for success and how to, when you arrive, what kind of impression you want to make, what you should do when you're at the interview, and then usually the area of most interest to people, how to handle some common interview questions, including some of those trickier ones like the behavioral questions. So part one, preparing for your interview. So for job interviews, I'll begin by saying an interview is usually a very important part of the application process. You can have a good resume, you can have a good cover letter, and you can have all the experience and the knowledge and the skills to do a job successfully and be in a position to succeed. But oftentimes you're not going to be able to get a job without doing an interview first. And it's a really sort of crucial step in the process. So interviews by nature tend to be fairly nerve-wracking. A lot of people get anxious, get nervous, and of course it can be hard to sort of speak and think on your feet, especially when you're being asked occasionally difficult or uncomfortable questions. But if you do well, and if you have some knowledge about how to approach the interview successfully, you're going to have a much better chance of landing those jobs that you want to get. So the first slide we have here, it talks about some common nonverbal mistakes that can happen during job interviews. And for everyone watching, nonverbal communication actually comprises the biggest part of how we communicate. So it's actually a bigger part than what we actually say when we're engaged in speaking. So here's some of the common nonverbal faults that hiring managers report the people they interview engage in. So the first one, about 67%, around 2/3 of people fail to make eye contact with the person who is asking the questions or conducting the interview. 47%, just under half, enter the interview having little knowledge of the company. 38% don't smile, so they end up either coming across as standoffish or they may come across as being nervous or uncertain. 33% have bad posture. 33% fidget too much, so things like drumming your hands on the table, tapping your foot, fiddling with your hair or with your hands, things like that can be distracting. They can lead to a bad impression. The little factoid here in the top right corner, a survey of more than 2,000 hiring managers, about 33% claim to know whether or not they're going to hire a candidate within the first 90 seconds. So true or not, that does sort of underline how important making a good first impression is. And then the other facts we have here on the right-hand side. So these are the big components that go into making a successful first impression. So 55% is accounted for by the way you dress, act, and how you walk through the door. About 38% depends on the quality of your voice, the grammar you use when speaking, and your confidence. But interestingly, only 7% is determined by the actual words that you choose to say. So when you're getting ready for an interview, usually you're going to be contacted at least a day or a couple of days in advance. So in most cases, you're going to have some time to get ready for it. And of course, that's always a good thing. So some of the advice we give to candidates are, take some time, do some research, and get to know the company. So if they have a website, visit the website. If they've been in the news, like read the news pieces about them. Most businesses today, they're active online in some capacity. Either they have an official site that you can go to, or maybe they're selling stuff over the web. Or even if they don't have that, most will at least have something like a Facebook account or a Twitter account. So go visit them, go visit those online assets, read up on the company and learn as much as you can about it. The second part, know about the job as much as you can. Sometimes it's hard to do this. You're not going to be able to find maybe a lot of information beforehand. But if you can, you should definitely try and find out what's going to be involved with the role. What will you be doing? If you can, find out, who does the job report to or what position does it report to. Try to get an idea of how much it pays. In some cases, a lot of the positions we advertise for at Employment Solutions, they'll post a wage or they'll post a salary range on the job advertisement, but not every position or employer will do this. And we do recognize that in some cases, you might not be able to find out all this information before going in for an interview. But just sort of the key takeaway we'd like to give is like, whatever you can find out about both the company and the job, try and do that and go into the interview with your eyes open and with a good understanding of both the workplace and what's likely to be expected from you as a potential employee. And then the last part we have here, so, know yourself, understand what experiences you have, think about stories that you have that you could tell over the course of an interview that will demonstrate how you have the knowledge and skills that the employer you've applied to is looking for. So enter into it with a good understanding of your own strengths and your own weaknesses too. Okay, so the next step, preparing for your interview, make sure you know where you're going. And of course, right now with COVID-19, most of us are all cooped up at home. So my sense is a lot of interviews today are probably going to happen over the phone, or they might happen over something like Teams, like we're using today, or Skype or Zoom or something else. But when we do get back to the point where you go for in-person interviews, make sure you know where you have to go beforehand. So check something like Google Maps or MapQuest. Make sure you know the address. Make sure you know what the building looks like. You can even drive or walk by the place where you're going to do the interview the day before. When you're getting ready to leave for the interview, always aim to get there a bit early if you can. You don't want to be there like hours early, but if you can get in 10, 15 minutes ahead of time, leave yourself some buffer in case you get delayed, in case there's a train crossing the tracks somewhere along the way, so that you don't show up there right when the interview is due to start and you're getting nervous. Make sure you don't have someone who's waiting for you after the fact, and don't have somewhere you need to be either right before or after. So if you have a job interview coming up, make sure you don't have a dental appointment happening an hour and a half before it's due to start, or some other obligation that you have to get to right after the interview. It's not uncommon for interviews can run long, or they can get pushed back depending if they're interviewing multiple candidates that day. So just try not to have anything that's going to play on your mind and be a potential distraction that's going to take you out of the moment and take you out of focusing on succeeding in the interview. So here's some of the top tips on the little graphic. So practice and rehearse your answers beforehand. And we're going to get to the section on the common questions. I do mock interviews with clients at Employment Solutions from time to time. And I always encourage folks, a lot of questions are very sort of predictable. You may not know everything they're going to ask you for each job you apply for, but some questions crop up time and again. So if you have a hard time, getting your answers out in person or speaking, think about what you want to say beforehand, or even write it out. Even write out 4 or 5 sentences for a given question and script what you want to say. You don't necessarily want to come off as scripted when you answer the questions, but you want to be able to call to mind the points that you really want to cover. So I always encourage people, practice, write out some of the questions or write out some of the bullet points you want to make sure to get across. And if you can, spend some time rehearsing or practicing in front of a mirror. Or, if you're working with Employment Solutions, you can approach us about doing a mock interview a day or two prior, or you could rehearse with a family member or friend even if you like. So get ready ahead of time, pick out your clothes, beforehand, know what you're going to wear, know where all the stuff you need is going to be. Again, cut down on your stress that you might encounter when you're getting ready to actually go to the business, or they're going to be calling you or Skyping you to do the interview itself. Do your best to stay calm. I know it's always easier said than done. I've been through what feels like a zillion job interviews at this point, but it's always a case of butterflies in the stomach. But do your best to stay calm and try not to, again, engage in any behaviors or engage in any thinking patterns that's going to increase your anxiety or your stress levels as you prepare to go for the interview itself. As we said before, spend a little time researching the company. It's always great when you're asked a question and you can filter in a little bit of knowledge about the company into your answer, because that tends to really impress folks at the business or the people doing the interview, showing that you have that sort of drive and you sort of have that interest in them, and you've obviously spent some time doing your homework. Be there on time, as we discussed before. That means at least a couple minutes early. And then not everyone always does this, but it's sometimes recommended. You can follow up after the interview, just a very simple, like, thank you for your time, email or note. That's often enough. Again, it just shows that you're courteous and that you're keen to be working with the company. So dressing for success, a little bit about what you might want to consider as you sort of pick out what to wear. General rule, you want to dress appropriately and professionally for the position. So clothes should be cleaned, ironed, and in style. So if you're thinking of wearing something like bell bottoms or something, like like a running race shirt from 1986, those sorts of fashion choices are kind of not recommended in most cases. As a general rule, dress pants, a dress shirt. For men, a tie is sometimes appropriate. For ladies, a skirt or a blouse. Again, though, bearing in mind, this is going to depend on the nature of the job that you're interviewing for. Some positions are going to be much more casual and much less concerned with your mode of dress than others. For example, labor positions, the dress is often more casual. If you're going to be working in a shop in overalls or coveralls or work gear, it's unlikely that they're going to be as concerned if you show up in a suit and tie. However, for a lot of positions, especially managerial ones or professional roles, they're going to expect a fairly professional style dress. For some roles, for men, a full suit may be appropriate. Dress or dress pants for women is certainly appropriate too. Again, depends on the company and the position. The old rule of thumb was to dress for the job that's one above what you're interviewing for. So if you're going in for an entry-level job, maybe wear the clothes you think you would need to wear if you were to become a supervisor or a manager in that same company. And this is, I find this advice occasionally kind of patronizing, but we'll go over it very quickly anyways. So when you're going for a job interview, I think it always kind of goes out without saying, you want to look, feel, and come across as your best. So for guys, and it is hard right now during COVID because all the salons and barbershops are closed, but get a haircut or trim if you need to do that. For men, if you wear a beard, you want to either shave or neaten it beforehand. Some of these other points, brush your teeth, wear deodorant. I think that's, kind of self-explanatory. For women, usually recommended, don't overdo it with makeup necessarily, jewelry or hair products. Sometimes a little perfume or cologne can be okay. However, in a lot of office environments today, and more workplaces are moving this way, many work sites today are moving towards scent-free environments. Some people have sensitivities to different scents and different smells. So if you know that the workplace is such a place and they've informed you of that, usually they will tell you beforehand, you definitely don't want to wear any sort of scented product. So generally, though, they will let you know about that ahead of time. So just bear that in mind, though, as you're getting ready for an interview. So at the interview itself, here's some do's and don'ts. And again, the message here, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. So here's some of the things to do while you're waiting for your interview. So generally, most places, if you're doing it in person, you're going to arrive, you're going to talk to maybe an administrative assistant, they'll send you a place to sit, or they'll tell you where to wait, and then the hiring manager or the folks on the interview panel will come and get you. But while you're waiting, here's some of the advice that is recommended. So the first and biggest, and I think it's kind of a matter of common sense, you want to be pleasant to everybody around you. So anyone you encounter as you come in, you want to make sure you're polite with them. As it says here, your interview starts the moment you enter the company. You'll probably be doing an interview with a panel of people, but it's not uncommon for after the fact for the people on the hiring committee to come out and ask, the receptionist or the frontline worker, well, what did you think of that last person who comes in? So oftentimes feedback can come from just about anywhere in terms of making hiring decisions. So you always want to make sure that you're giving off a good impression to everyone you encounter. So you're looking happy, enthusiastic, and interested in being there. Point number two, much the same. If there's a receptionist who greets you first, spend a little time engaging with them. You can engage in some light conversation, maybe try to get a little more information about the company. So the suggested question here, like, how would you describe the work environment here? You could ask a question or two like that. Again, just show your interest and show your sort of friendly attitude and disposition. Point number three, you want to have confident body language. So generally it's recommended, folks, you want to have good posture. So enter the room with a strong upright power pose that helps you, A, feel more confident in yourself, and also projects that confidence to other people who see you. So some of the good body language to engage in is, looking people in the eye, shaking hands if they offer their hand, not crossing your arms, not adopting anything that can look kind of negative or hostile. When we do these workshops in person, often we have a little exercise about nonverbal communication as a group along the way. It's a little harder to do this in sort of an online environment. But again, remember, body language, nonverbal communication, it's very important. So you want to project confidence pretty much all the time as you go into and then conduct the interview itself. Point number four, and it's very important for us here in this modern age, you want to turn off and put away your phone. So fiddling around with your phone, checking email, social media, this can look unprofessional. It's also possible that you're going to see something that's going to distract you, or you're going to get an alert, or you're going to get a phone call in the middle of you answering a question that's going to rattle you. So again, all these things can put you off your game. Generally, when you arrive, once you're ready to head into the interview, like, just turn the phone off, power it down, and then you don't have to worry about it becoming a distraction. So what to bring with you when you go to the interview? Copies of your resume. So generally you want to bring at least 3 copies that you can have, and if necessary, leave there for members of the company to look over. The other advice I give folks as they prepare for interviews during mock interviews is you can refer to stuff on your resume, but don't presume that the people interviewing you have necessarily read it all that thoroughly or are necessarily able to remember what was on there. So we'll talk about this a bit more when we get to the answering the common questions part. But if you ever reference having certain experience on your resume, make sure you're very explicit in how you describe it. So you can say something like, as you see on my resume, I have 5 years in the customer service field working in positions with, and then describe all those things. Don't sort of leave things at a general level. Like, you'll notice on my resume, I have extensive customer service. Again, remember, the hiring manager or the HR person, they might see dozens, hundreds of resumes, and they may have a difficult time, calling to mind yours specifically. So make sure you're specific when you're giving answers about stuff that's on your resume. You can also bring a portfolio of related work, projects, and or certificates. This can be important for some jobs. References. What we always advise folks is bring your references with you. They may not have asked for them in the job posting, but generally they're going to want them. And it is, again, it can be kind of nerve-wracking to show up to an interview, and I've had this happen to myself. You show up, and then they're pushing a form at you like, oh, okay, can you just jot down the names, relationships, and contact information for 3 or 4 references? And then again, you're left scrambling around, looking on your phone, finding emails, finding phone numbers, and it's distracting you, and it's creating that added layer of stress. So bring a sheet of your references with you and be prepared to leave those behind. And here's what you don't want to bring. You don't want to bring your own beverages in hand, so coffee, soft drink, bottle of water. Many places, if it's going to be a longer interview, say 30 minutes or more, they will offer you something to drink, like a coffee or a water in most cases, but don't bring your own with you. Again, we've talked about cell phones before. It goes for the same for other electronic devices, tablets, music players, anything like that. Again, just leave those things behind so that they can't be posing a distraction. Again, you don't want it to be wearing headphones, no videos, music, etc. And gum. Chewing gum is sort of on the forbidden list. So make sure you're not doing that. So basically, don't show up to an interview, eating, drinking, chewing gum, anything along those lines. Okay, so common questions. I'm just going to zip back to the Teams window and check. See if we have any chat questions at the moment. And I think we're good. So I'm going to zip back to the presentation here. So common interview questions. So the first one, and this is probably the most common of all, is tell me about yourself. A lot of places, they'll use this essentially as an icebreaker type of question. They know that you're nervous to be speaking to them. In some cases, they're nervous to be speaking to you. And having that kind of easy question, it's just a way to get you talking, get the nerves out, and just sort of get everybody into the flow of the interview. Now, that said, I can't tell you how many times I've done a mock interview. This is almost always the first question. And as soon as it's asked, the person like locks up and gets flustered and says, I never know what to say about this. So how we advise people to handle this question is you don't want to spend a ton of time with this because they're going to ask you meatier questions later on, but you do want to take the opportunity to make the most of answering the question, sell yourself a bit, and highlight some of the key value that you can bring as an employee. So what we tell people to do is look to spend about 60 seconds or a little less answering the question. When you form the answer, you'll want to talk principally about three things. You want to talk about your prior work experience, and if you have some to cite. You want to talk about your education background, and you want to talk about your own positive traits and skills or knowledge as an individual. So you want to focus on those things. And again, you think in terms of what the employer is looking for and try and have those attributes of yours line up with what they need in an employee. The one thing I kind of counsel people not to do is if you get this question, don't immediately dive into a whole bunch of like personal information about yourself. A few little highlights, that can be fine to kind of put out there if it's interesting, but you don't want to be the person who starts talking about, well, I'm 37 years old and right now I'm training for a marathon and I enjoy, walking dogs. Like that stuff is all good, but it's not all that relevant in a work context in most cases. And you might also give away some sensitive information that maybe you don't want to. So focus on the three areas and try to have linkages to the job that you're interviewing for. So work experience, educational background and credentials, and your traits and skills as a potential employee. The next one is, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And again, you're almost always asked at least one of these questions. So this is where it goes back to the idea of preparing beforehand. So think ahead of time of what your strengths are, and think ahead of time too of what your weaknesses are. If you can, if they ask this together as a double-barreled question, usually it's separate. It's usually like, tell me what three of your strengths are. Then the next question will be, tell me what a weakness of yours is, or tell me your greatest weakness. But if they ask them together, start with your weakness first, if possible, and then finish with the strength. Now, I think we all have individual strengths, so I'm not necessarily going to try and tell you today what you should select for those. But the weaknesses, there is a bit of, I think, thought that's needed to go into it. As you see on the one point here, we advise people you want to choose a weakness that's not going to be a deal breaker for the employer. So generally that means choosing something that's minor, that's believable, but that can also be fixable, and it's not going to be a major concern for the employer. And again, the subheading, so don't identify something that's listed as a main task in the job description. What I tell folks is, you need to be honest, and what you say has to be a believable weakness. So if you try to pull one of the stunts where you say, well, my real weakness is that, like, I'm a workaholic, or I'm a perfectionist, or I don't let other people do work and I try to do it all myself. A lot of times, like, the people doing the interview are a little smarter than that. They see what you're doing. You're trying to jujitsu a weakness into a secret strength sort of thing. Oftentimes this doesn't come across as quite believable. So pick something that is real, that's, truthful, but that is not going to be a deal killer. So just for example, and I've told folks this, if you say you have a problem with punctuality, say you have a hard time getting up in the morning, and you're going someplace where it's really important that you're on time, you may not want to bring that up. You have some discretion in what you choose to talk about if you're asked for a weakness. Now, I will say to you, if punctuality is important and you take a job where it's important and you're not punctual, that's something you got to figure out how to work with kind of in your own personal life. But you may want to be telling them about something else, in the moment when you get asked that question. So when you get the weakness, think of something that's fairly minor. And then you also want to explain what you've done to either address it or work on it, or how you recognize it was a weakness and what you're doing to fix it, sort of thing. So there's a little more. I didn't want to beat on too long there because it sort of carries on talking about strengths and weaknesses. So in terms of strengths, choose ones that the employer is looking for as much as possible. You want to come across as confident, but you want to sort of skate the line between confidence and bragging. As much as you can, give like tangible, concrete examples of how you exhibit that strength. So think of little stories that you could tell to illustrate how you have a certain strength. So if you're a hard worker, figure out how you can quickly put that into words other than just saying I'm a hard worker. I'm a hard worker because, or I'm committed to improving myself because I participated in the YJC program with Employment Solutions, and I've done this and I've done that. As much as you can, be specific. So examples of weaknesses, and here's some of the ones that people can sometimes use: afraid of public speaking, being shy, math skills or computer skills. Again, depending on the position, if you have to run a cash register or something, you might be careful about saying, you have math anxiety or that sort of thing. Oops, sorry about that, guys. Let's see if I can get back to that. And again, the second point, always mention how you're working. No, I was trying to go to a link. Always mention how you're working to improve on the weakness. So something I've often done is, if I'm asked for this question, I'll talk about how one of my weaknesses was, for a long time, I was very poor at handling criticism. And, I do a lot of writing and I do a lot of creative stuff in my work. And if someone didn't like a piece I'd written or they didn't like a graphic I'd made, I'd tend to take that very personally. But then from there, after acknowledging that, I'll segue into, my own little story about how I realized it was counterproductive to be like that, and the steps I took to, improve on that weakness. And below, here's some examples of strengths: being punctual, reliable, responsible, good organization and time management. And of course, I think you can think of a whole lot of others: hardworking, et cetera, et cetera. So that was must have been going to a video or a blog post or something, so we'll skip that. So interview questions continued. So next one, how would your colleagues or supervisors describe you? If you're younger, sometimes you'll get, how would your teachers or how would your classmates describe you? This can be awkward for people. Most of us, who are Canadians, we tend to be sort of a humble lot. We don't really like, saying stuff that feels like bragging or boasting. But as I tell people in mock interviews, you have to be willing to go and sell yourself and be confident in selling yourself. Because if you're not able to do that, someone else probably will, and they may get the job ahead of you. But if you get a question like this, you want to focus on talking about your personality, talking about your work ethic, talking about your reliability, and all the other sort of positive traits that you exhibit as an individual. Another common question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You're often asked this, and the employer may want to see how ambitious you are. They may be interested to know if you're willing to learn and advance, or if you have some interest in staying with their company and moving ahead. They also want to know, are you looking to stay with one company for a while or jump around? Generally, I say to folks, you should answer this honestly. If you're just looking for a job and you're not necessarily expecting to retire at that place, you can say so. But be careful how you approach it too. Don't sort of give the impression that you'll be out of town at the next opportunity. The next one, we're starting to get into behavioral questions, and these are often difficult, and they're often ones that we have to spend the most time sort of explaining how to handle. So behavioral questions, they always sort of lead with this format where it's tell me about a time or describe a time where, and you see some of the examples here. So had to deal with change, faced disappointment or failure, had to work under stress or a tight deadline, or where you missed a deadline, had to deal with a difficult customer or person, experienced conflict in the workplace, and worked as part of a team. So for behavioral questions, the reason you're asked these is because the employer is interested in knowing how you've handled certain things in the past. And it's known from psychology that our past behavior is a great predictor of how we're likely to behave in the future. So for these questions in particular, I always encourage folks to sort of think in terms of stories, think in terms of telling a story. And there's an approach called the STAR method that we're going to get to in a moment that will flesh that out a little bit more. But when you give an answer to this and you tell the story, explain the situation. So set up the context, talk about what you did to handle the situation, and then the outcome. Always make sure you include an outcome and explain what you did that improved the situation or how you dealt with it better after this situation occurred. Again, sort of like the weaknesses question, you have some judgment in what you choose to talk about. And this is why I encourage people, like, spend the time beforehand preparing and rehearsing a little bit and get those stories in your mind that you want to tell in response to certain questions, because you want to choose experiences that ended well. A common question is one like, tell me when you had conflict with a coworker or a teammate. Well, maybe you have a story about that, but if that story ends with, you and the coworker getting into a fist fight or something, like, that's not the one you want to be drawing out of the well. So you want situations that generally, ended well. Either there was a positive outcome or it was, an outcome that was difficult, but there was some learning and things were handled about as best as well as they could. Don't pick ones that are going to ultimately reflect poorly on yourself. So again, know yourself and your experiences. And then to prepare for these questions, you can use the STAR method. Let me get to that in a moment. So this is the approach. So STAR, situation. So you want to set the scene. So say you get a question, tell me about a time you had to deal with a difficult customer. Okay, well, there was a time when I was working on the front cash at Tim Hortons, and it was a busy morning. And then this guy came up and he was upset because. So explain the context, basically. Kind of like, just like reading a novel or watching a film, have that introductory part that sets up the context. So the T is the task. Describe the purpose. So again, describe what the sort of problem was and how it needed to be addressed. For A, action. So this is where you want to explain what you did. So you got a complaint from a customer that something was wrong. You weren't able to handle it yourself. What did you do? So maybe your action is you brought the concern with the manager because they had the right permissions to, enable a refund or enable a return or give them a store credit. Or, maybe you didn't do that, but explain what you did and go into detail about what you tried to do. to help the situation. And the last part again is our result. So share the result, share the outcome of everything that happened up to that point. And a lot of times when I'm doing mock interviews, I'll have folks going through it. They'll do a really great job, like describing the situation, describing their involvement and what they did, but then they kind of leave it sort of dangling in terms of the outcome. So they're at the call center and they got the call and the guy was really angry and they did all these things, and then they kind of just leave it off. So you have to make sure you share the outcome. And again, think about how to describe that ahead of time. So, even though we couldn't give the customer a full refund, they were able to get, some money in store credit, and they were understanding, and, they left a lot happier than when they had come in or something like that. A few more questions. How do you keep yourself organized at work? So here you want to talk about your time management skills, your tools, your ability to prioritize. So you might want to say use calendars, you make to-do lists, you put reminders in your phone. Those can all be good ideas. What are your salary expectations? Many times you'll be applying or interviewing for jobs where they operate on a salary grid, or they start at a certain wage and it's kind of non-negotiable, and you may know that coming in. As you advance through your career though, you may interview for more advanced jobs where there's the flexibility to negotiate or the rates of pay are variable. So if you get asked this, it's kind of a touchy question. Make sure you know the job and the company and also the industry that it's part of. Go into the interview, understanding, is this likely to be a minimum wage start, or does the company have a pay grid that starts higher? Consider, is this your first job, or is this your first job in a new field? How does that influence like what you should expect to earn? I tell folks, if you get this question in an interview and you don't feel comfortable answering it, you can always say, I'd rather wait till you identify me as the preferred candidate and we have a letter of offer to discuss before we sort of get into this kind of discussion. That's usually enough to kind of put the question off if you're not comfortable answering it at that moment. Another one, and this can be tricky. Why did you leave your last job? So here you have to try and be honest, but you don't want to speak negatively about past employers. Again, as we said a few slides ago, our past behavior predicts how we're going to act in the future. So a manager who hears you running down a place you worked before probably will come away with the feeling that at some time in the future, they could be speaking to someone else and saying the same thing about them and their company. So you should try and be honest. If you had friction with your boss or your coworker at the last place, or things didn't end well, you can be honest in describing that, but don't get into a lot of finger pointing and don't get into a lot of negativity about other places you have worked. Why should we hire you? Again, be prepared. This could be a question you get asked right off the hop. So again, think from the employer's perspective. How would hiring you be a benefit to them? And again, you want to describe in concrete terms how you have the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they are looking for. So, talk about things like your past experiences, your educational background, your knowledge, specific skills and strengths, all the good parts of your personality, your own work ethic. Again, adopt the mindset of being the employer. Don't necessarily talk about how getting the job would be, great for you. They understand that you're self-interested and like you want a job and you want to be earning money and that sort of thing, but you don't want to just focus on like, I'm really looking for a job right now and I think this would be great and having the money coming in would be good. They kind of understand that already. So talk about what you're going to bring to them and how you can bring value to the company. Why do you want to work here? Again, you just usually want to describe that, your own goals and your skills, ambitions, that they're a good fit with the company. And you want to try and get across that, you're excited about the opportunity. Hopefully you're genuinely excited, and that the company is an employer of choice for you. A couple other ones to just sort of be wary of, off the wall questions. So if you're an animal, what kind of animal would you be? Or what kind of plant would you be? What's your favorite color? If you could play a professional sport, what position would you play? If you could have dinner with any three people from throughout human history, who would they be? These questions, sometimes you get them from places where it's kind of like they want to sort of throw you out of your sort of path a little bit, because they understand sometimes that candidates come in sort of having rehearsed and having sort of set answers that they want to give. So sometimes asking one of these oddball questions can kind of jar people and get them thinking a little differently. So when you answer these questions, again, be honest, provide answers that reflect your personality. Don't try and fool them or give like a really like sort of like an answer that's going to outsmart them type of thing. But just, be honest and don't spend a lot of time agonizing over how like you answer this. I remember once I got a question like, if I could be any other living thing that exemplifies my personality, like what would it be? And it probably took me like 3 minutes before I could figure out what to say about it. So again, these questions are just sort of to throw you a little bit, and it helps the employer see how you can think on your feet. Okay, so there are some touchy areas that by law employers are not supposed to be asking you about, and that you are not obligated to answer questions about. And these are the ones right here. So your race or racial identity, your age, your religion, marital status, children, or if you, as the next bullet says, pregnancy, if you're expecting a child, if you have a disability, and your sexual orientation. Now, notwithstanding what the law and what the Human Rights Code says, some places may ask you about this, or they may try and find ways to get the information out of you. So again, just bear in mind, you have the right to refuse to answer these questions. You're not obligated to. If you get one, you could say, I understand that this is a protected question under the Human Rights Code, and I'm not comfortable answering it. It also says if you could think of a way to answer them strategically if you choose. The choice is up to you, but you don't have to answer them. The other point I always make to folks is, if you're answering in the course of answering questions in an interview, or even if you're just conversing with members of the company beforehand or afterwards, be careful about the information that you volunteer. So you may say in passing, you may make reference in passing to being married, say, or you may say in passing, well, my wife and I, or my husband and I, we're expecting our first child 5 months from now, and we're excited about that. If you do that, the employer hasn't asked you about any of this, but now they know, right? And in some cases, your answers to these questions, it might prejudice their hiring decision or how they feel about you as a candidate. It's not supposed to, that's the law. But it can happen if they obtain that information. Questions for the employer. Usually at the end, they always give you, the last question is usually before they let you go, like, do you have any questions for us? In our mock interviews, we always counsel folks to go into the interview, have like 2 or 3 questions that you're ready to ask the hiring committee. So it can be things like, tell me a bit more about the company or the hiring team. Could you describe a bit more about the job itself? What's a typical shift like working this position? Or what's the typical career path in the company for someone who starts in this role? You can bring a notebook or portfolio with you to organize your items, and you can put into it anything they give you, or you can jot down answers that they give you to the questions. You can also ask when they expect to make a hiring decision. That's always fair. They may be a little vague about some of those questions, but it's certainly within your rights to ask them. The reason why it's important to ask the questions, again, it shows that you're interested. It shows that you're keen about the company and also the position. It shows that you're trying to put some thought into what working there would be like, and you're trying to gather as much information as you can. If you don't have any questions ready, sometimes you can come across as looking, a little bit disinterested. And of course, that's not the impression you want to give. Just a few more points. It's your job to know about the company, so try and find out what you can beforehand and take advantage of the time during the interview process to learn a bit more about the company and, again, if it would be a good fit for you. We generally advise people, again, notwithstanding, we've talked about this a few slides back, if they don't ask you about salary, benefits, or other compensation matters, don't be the one to bring it up, especially if it's in the first interview. Generally, if these are going to be negotiated, that's going to happen later, either at a second interview or when they decide to provide you with the job offer. Okay, so that is or was the presentation.